Perhaps we start, and people also, because I have like just a very short introduction as well. And okay, so hello everyone, and welcome back after the nice and of course intense day that we had yesterday. And I'm very, very happy to welcome today as our second keynote speakers for this event. Happy to welcome Andrea Krizsán, I guess.
Yeah.
And yeah, okay. And so Andrea is associate professor at the moment at the School of Public Policy and at the Gender Studies Department, and the research fellow as well at the Democracy Institute at Central European University. And so her research, her work, I would say her huge body of work, it's mainly focused in basically understanding policy change in countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And she has worked extensively on different equality policy fields, including gender equality policies, policies on gender-based violence, policies addressing ethnic inequality and intersectionality. And at the moment, her current research aims to analyze the politics of policy backsliders in type of crisis and deliberate democracy and forms of resistance to such reversal. She has been the recipient of an inaugural Emma Goldman Award for her substantial contribution to the study of feminist and inequality issues in Europe. And well, if you are curious about her work, you would find like plenty of her great publications in many, like high impact outlets from Politics and Governments, European Journal of Politics and Gender, Journal of International and Comparative Social Politics, and so on and so forth. And her last book, in collaboration with Connie Rogeband, analyzed the domestic violence policies reforms in 5 Central and Eastern European countries. And I think this is also the topic of the keynotes that we will we are just about to listen to. And amongst the many works that she is currently working on, I would like to mention like the Horizon 2020 project called Supera, which which like the acronym stands for Supporting the Promotion of Equality in Research and Academia, which I think it's also like a quite important topic and something that we have also like extensively talked about yesterday. So really, I'm very, very happy to welcome you, Andrea. And I think it's, basically like your keynote is also like kind of illustrating and showcasing like some of the, like one of the other aspects and another angle from what we heard yesterday from Eva, and another angle which is also very important for like, the topics and the nexus and the interconnections that we have tried to tackle during these 2 days. So really, thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction. You said everything about me, so it's very nice of you. Thank you. And thank you for all of you for waking up so early and lining up in front of the computer for another long day. I much appreciate that. I go straight in the middle of it. I will share my screen now. Let me know, please confirm if you see. Can you tell me, Francesca? Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, okay, so good that you mentioned my work with Connie Rogeband, because this is on domestic violence in countries of Central of Eastern Europe. So this is a little bit of a continuation, and I have to say that this is also work that we do together, and actually we also presented a little bit of it already together. So I'm taking it a little further from there. So this is a recent a book project that we've been working on, and we're almost at the end, really at the end by now. It's about how the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, the convention developed by the Council of Europe and adopted in 2011, and which entered into force in 2014, changed that field of violence against women policies in these countries. We're not covering 5 countries in this research, but only 4. So Bulgaria, Croatia, Hungary, and Poland. And And it's important to note that these are, I mean, many of you, I'm sure you know, but let me just the last recap for those of you who don't, that these are very different ratification outcomes in these 4 countries. In Bulgaria, ratification was blocked by a constitutional court decision saying that the convention is not constitutional, not compatible with the Bulgarian constitution. Croatia and Poland ratified, though Poland has been actively working in the last years to withdraw from ratification, basically, which is quite outstanding. And then Hungary also has not ratified, has blocked ratification with the parliamentary decision, which said that Hungary will not ratify. So this is the four countries in a nutshell. And just to tell you just a few, so I will go into the substance in a minute, but I wanted to get to get through the formalities. So just a few words about the data. So this is quite substantive qualitative research, which partly builds on what we knew already about these countries from before. So it was interesting for us to come and work with these countries because we knew the pre-Istanbul Convention times here. So that was a quite solid knowledge. And then we came in and started to look at these countries with qualitative methods to see how things have changed. And we do process tracing. We analyze protest events. We analyze a lot of documents. We use frame analysis for that. But this is all qualitative analysis. And we worked with researchers in the various countries who have provided a lot of very, very valuable and good data for us. So just this is by way of introduction. And let me just go then into the substance of what we found. So of course there is no way for me to present a whole book, even though this is just a pivot, not a large book. But I have a mic. Somebody's mic is on. Can that person turn it off? Yeah, there's a lot of noise in my computer. Yeah, thank you. So okay, so what's the puzzle? Why was this whole Istanbul Convention thing interesting for us? Well, what we know about the field of violence against women in the region is that it's a field of relative success in terms of among the feminist issues. Is the one issue that was in its different forms were picked in all of these countries, and there was quite a lot of policy development happening, and all of it because there was feminist mobilization taking place. There was there was controversy about all of these policies, but what is interesting here that even though the issue was put on the agenda by feminists and as a gender equality issue, the debates were never about gender equality. They never basically mentioned in either of these countries gender or women, even women's rights. The term violence against women was hardly ever coined, so debates were very degendered, and all the policy successes were avoiding the elephant in the room. So they regulated rape, domestic violence, stalking, and so on, without ever mentioning that these are issues of gender inequality. So then the contestation that the Istanbul Convention brought and that erupted in relation to the Istanbul Convention was all about gender equality and about the term gender and about women's rights. So in that sense, it was really surprising to see this. And at first, and I tell you a little bit of the personal insight of this book story, at first we were like, I would say almost happy in a way, because politicization was pretty impressive. It was good to see that after so many years of silence, and this was a lot of my research work was dealing with this, about all this long silence about gender. Now we're finally discussing how violence is linked to gender, and that was so important. And in that sense, we were rather optimistic about the benefits this could bring. Well, it's true, there's a lot of attacks against, but it also brings some really interesting turn to how we talk about violence, and it seemed to generate new solidarities, a lot more awareness about violence against women, coining the term violence against women finally. new actors, new frames. So these were the reasons for optimism. But then the more we looked and the more we had data coming in and looking more carefully at what this brought, well, then that showed also a lot of the problems with this politicization. So overall, what we did in this book was to look at, not just to look at the attacks, and in fact, attacks were not our primary interest, but our interest was to see how these attacks on the gender aspects of the Istanbul Convention brought to the field of violence against women, to violence against women's policies to these countries, and also to women's movements active in the field of violence against women. Theoretically, I don't go a lot into theory right now. I just want to point to the two directions where we hope to be able to contribute. One is the large amounts of literature on the war on gender, which is really fascinating literature, and they have covered a lot already. What we kind of miss there and where we would like to contribute is attention to violence against women. It is an interesting field. It is said to be one of those fields which are much more compatible with mainstream human rights thinking for reasons of physical violence, and there's a series of reasons. So we want to bring a little bit to bring the focus to violence against women and to look at these not so evidently controversial or differently controversial field if we look coming from the war on gender perspective. And we also would like to contribute by doing systematic comparison between countries, which is rarely the case with the war on gender literature. And also we would like to contribute by looking at the impact of the war on gender. So not just what is happening, but also what this does to the movement, to women's movement, and to policies in more generally. And our other angle, our other hope to contribute is on the literature on democracy and democratic backsliding. This is an agenda that we have for some time now with Connie to really to understand and to use these moments of attack on gender to maybe take further the thinking on gender and democracy, and to see how gender is problematized and how these attacks on gender are part, in fact, of the democratization. And in this, we primarily want to intervene and in the longer term to contribute to mainstream literature on the democratization, which is conspicuously silent on the gender aspect of this issue. And then we also want to look at how this violence against women issue is part of the democracy question, and to see in this specific field what these debates about violence against women tell us or teach us about what is a what gender democracy or gender sensitive democracy notions mean. So this is more just very shortly. What I want to talk about is like 3 parts. It will be in 3 parts. First, it's about the attacks. I mean, you need we needed to map these two, and it was a very interesting part of our research. Then we look at consequences for violence against women activism, and not just women's rights activism, but the wider field of actors who are pro-Istanbul Convention and the combating violence against women. And then thirdly, the consequences for the policy field for violence against women policies. So let me take them one by one. First, attacks, the opponents to the Istanbul Convention. And let's look at actors first. So I didn't mention this when I was talking about the puzzle, but there's another interesting puzzling element in this whole thing around the Istanbul Convention. The history of passing conventions and international treaties and so on in the region is very technocratic. So there was never a convention in this region which was debated by publics and politically in open political debates. Passing or ratifying international norms in the region is the region is generally very good students. They always do their homework. They diligently ratify whatever they have to ratify because the international community expects them. And of course, they might not implement it, but there was never an issue around ratification. So it was, everybody kind of expected that the Istanbul Convention will be no different. And in fact, it looked like it will not be different. So the only country, all 3 of the 4 countries have signed and went on after signature for years without any debate. It was only Poland where already at the point of signature debates erupted, but the rest, it was just this usual technocratic process. They didn't consult anybody. They just signed and they promised that they will deliver the ratification document. And debates erupted later, and then that's really an interesting thing, and it's interesting to see why this happens. In terms of actors, what we see, and what we see also from the literature, and this is indeed common for all the 4 countries, is that we do have a variety of actors. It's a variety that includes political parties, civil society, partly religious civil society actors, churches, think tanks and experts. That's a very interesting group of actors, but that's also present in all countries, and governments, illiberal or not so illiberal, but various government actors are definitely involved here. And what is also interesting looking from a point of view of violence against women is that a lot of these actors have never engaged with violence against women. So they come on board and start debating the convention without having a history of involvement in violence against women policies. But now what is different in the 4 countries? So this map, they are all there. Maybe there is one, just one note is that church is not everywhere. In Hungary, you don't see churches at all. So this tells us that it is possible to do these anti-gender campaigns without a church actors involved. But in all the others, it's a lot of similarity. But there is a difference in between the 4 countries in the trajectory of opening the contestation. So Croatia is an interesting case because there the war on gender, so-called, was going on for some time already. They had already referendum on including on traditional family in the constitution, a successful referendum. They had political debates and contestation around sexual education for quite some time by that time. So it seems like when the Istanbul Convention comes, this is a rather consolidated network, and it's an add-on. The Istanbul Convention issue is not something that erupts the whole contestation around gender. Whereas in the other countries, that's kind of different. So in Poland, of course, there's a lot of actors, and there was debates. There were a lot of debates already, and the church was very forceful in reproductive rights. But the so-called war on gender, or coining this gender ideology, language, and all of that, comes to Poland with the Istanbul Convention, according to local analysts. So that's an interesting turn. It starts very early. So there in Poland, it already in 2012, it erupts the whole issue before they actually sign the convention. So signature is already rather controversial. But the other 2 countries, Bulgaria and Hungary, there it just comes out of the blue with the Istanbul Convention. There is nothing to indicate that this would come, and especially the level of the genderness of their debates and of their silencing anything about gender equality in these 2 countries does not seem to justify any kind of such conflict. Then the other difference between the countries is who actually orchestrates, who the driving force of the opposition. So whereas you see in Croatia, as I mentioned, there is a very vivid and well-networked and consolidated civil society that is orchestrating this. And of course, this is a lot of these organizations are related to the church, but it's not the church actors themselves who orchestrate and speak up, but these civil society organizations. Whereas in Poland, you see the church is really the main speaker, and also to some extent in Bulgaria, the church is the main speaker in these political debates, with statements very often and at the very highest levels of the church. Speaking, it's different churches, it's Catholic and Orthodox respectively. Whereas in Hungary, the orchestration and the main actor behind the whole thing is the state, basically the government. And even though the protests start or the contestation is launched by some civil society organizations, but these are like, I would say, pseudo civil society organizations or gongos or whatever you may want to call. So these are organizations just recently created by the government with a lot of government funding as mouthpieces for the government. So they start and then the government lines up. So it's a very government run action. What are the strategies they use? We were totally impressed. Of course, this was already a little bit in the literature, but to see this in practice and how this is used in the different countries, it was really fascinating. It is a massive reliance on democratic tools. So it's rather than all kinds of disruptive and protest actions, what you see is using democracy for their purposes. So we see some conventional mobilizing strategies such as running petitions, but referenda is a usual threat. It doesn't happen in any of these countries, but having a referenda, that's something that is all the time kept in the discussion. Then petitions, so petitions have a major mobilizing force. They run quite frequently. In Poland, there is more than 10 petitions that are on the signature collections through this known platform, Citizen Go, but also in some of the other countries. So there is this appeal to the majority, that their arguments are majoritarian, the public supports them. Then there is the use of expert knowledge and expert contributions, and we see here think tanks and legal experts who have a very important role in the process, who are shaping basically the catalog of frames to talk about this issue, and who are the main informants for the government strategies as well. So they sit as in consultative groups and so on. So it's this reference to expertise is very, very important here. And then there is the legal tools. So not just that there is legal expertise, but legal tools are also used. So as I mentioned, in its constitutional court level, which is basically blocking ratification in Croatia, in Bulgaria, but the courts and litigation is threatened as something that is in the loop also in Croatia and in Poland, again at the constitutional level. So very, very interesting. Then another strategy to use. So once this is maybe the most interesting part of the mobilization or the strategies that we saw. But there is another 3 notes that I should make about strategies. One is that we see infiltration into states and sometimes even actually state capture. So you see opponents of the convention being increasingly being involved in government roles, and for instance in Poland you have already 2 judges in the Supreme Court who are coming from the movement, from one of the main actors of the movement there, anti-gender movement in Poland. You have ministers and so on. So that's that, and then consultative in consultation, policy consultation groups, they have a very important role. So we see we see how the link between the state and the anti-gender movement is very, very strong. Then we also see, and this is rather distinctive, not everywhere you see this grassroots action, mainly based on church infrastructure. You see in Croatia and Poland, and to some extent in Bulgaria, but none in Hungary, where this is all very elitist and NGO or Gongo based. And the final point about strategies is, and which is particularly relevant because we are talking about the field of violence against women, is the use of violence in this. You see smear campaigns in media, especially in social media, and the state is implicated in various ways, either by running some of these violent instruments like raids and blacklisting in government media and so on, and state persecution and extreme auditing against women's rights organizations. But there is also the unwillingness of the state to protect. So even where there is not a direct state violence, you see the state not doing the protection job, and then it is this semiotic violence kind of aspect of violence where you have all these terrible words and aggressive narratives against women's rights advocates. And of course, this is in a way, this violence and these attacks against this violence and violent attacks against advocates of the convention are in a way linked to the frame, the way they talk about the whole thing, the way the reasoning they give for their content or discontent with the Istanbul Convention. So a little bit about the frames they use. First of all, and this I mentioned already, we see an amazing paradigm change in talking about violence against women, from no mention of women, or almost no mention of women as victims at all, and not to speak of gender equality, to now basically talking all about violence against women. So that becomes a label that is very frequently used by high-level politicians and a lot of people, and recognized as a problem, and also about the gender component. So that's an amazing change here. And so what are the ways in which they bring frames? And I have not enough time to go into level of details that some of the war on gender literature has covered, but I just want to point some specific elements that are really interesting here. One is the way they bring in gender as a problematic legal category. So the way the convention names gender, they think that is a problematic terminology because contrary to a very essentialist and sex-based dichotomous distinction between men and women, this kind of, as they see it, continuous kind of gender in which you may have any number of kinds of gender, that is leading to legal uncertainty, and it blurs this very clear legal category, and it is very problematic for legal for the rule of law, basically. And that's the argument that is made in the Bulgarian Constitutional Court, that by introducing this blurred concept instead of the easy concept that they had before, which is sex, basically you are not going to be able to run your legal system as you did until then. So that's the main argument. I don't want to discuss whether this is accurate or not. I think you realize what it is, but I think this is important to see what they are saying. And a really interesting twist in this is that they say, well, if we're not going to be able to tell apart women from men anymore, then how are we going to give positive action support to women? So it is basically to the disadvantage of women, they say, if we start having this kind of a more blurred concept of gender. So that's one way they come against it. And I think the more solid and more important critique that they have, and that is better funded in terms of the content of the convention, is their arguments against the transformative character of the Istanbul Convention, and namely that the Istanbul Convention clearly connects violence against women to social change, to gender equal social change, to equalizing society, to challenging traditional family, or better said, traditional gender roles, because the convention doesn't speak about family per se, it speaks about gender roles and the stereotypes around those and the need to change those. So these arguments are clearly about that transformative character, and they juxtapose the problem with this transformative character of the convention with the problem of violence against women, which they clearly name and recognize as a problem. So they say, yes, violence against women is a problem, and we need to cope with that and combat it. But what is important is that we keep women as women. So they have this essentializing notion of women, in which women are kind of the victims to be protected. And that's acceptable, whereas the transformative approach of the convention is not. So I show you some quotes. I will not read them up. Maybe I share afterwards the presentation. Just the short ones. The Minister of Justice Varga in Hungary would say strong yes for the protection of women and strong no for illegal migration and gender ideology. This is the transformative understanding. And then another one from Polish Episcopal Conference, which says, although the title of the convention suggests that this is just a matter of counteracting violence, careful study of the text suggests that it is an attempt to introduce an ideological cultural revolution. So I won't go into the rest because time is running. And then, so this much about the gender framing. The other part of their frame, which is of course connected to gender, is about sovereignty and about how the convention is basically an attack on national sovereignty and that they need to defend that. And it is seen, the convention is seen as a form of imperialism, or like imposing norms from abroad on these countries, and that these norms are very much contrary to the traditional national norms. And so therefore, this is basically a challenge to national sovereignty. And then there is different ways they make this argument. One of the ways is that they are attacking the different, they are challenging the different actors who they see as agents of this foreign imperialism. Another way is, and I put this here, is that they also see migration as coming through the back door of the convention, basically. And the reason for that is that the convention is actually allowing or has articles on gender-based violence related asylum, or justification for asylum based on gender-based violence, different forms. So these are some of the forms. Again, some quotes here. From Hungary, this is one of the gongos, which says the ratification of the convention may mean the Trojan horse of gender ideology for Hungary. Or the Polish Episcopal Conference, the possible adoption of the convention, however, will deprive us of the sovereignty in the areas of morality and family. And then there is the foreign agents argument, where women's rights activists are vilified and they are seen as some kind of a conspiracy or part of some conspiracy with foreign left-wing Marxist allies. And it's not just them, it's the LGBT lobby and the women's rights activists and left-wing politicians and politicians in the EU. And in general, NGOs who are progressive NGOs within the EU. So just some quotes. International lobbies are pushing Bulgaria to legalize the third gender, says the Deputy Prime Minister at one point. Or in Croatia, civil society quote, we will do everything to suppress such illegal, morally unacceptable, socially destructive and other perfidious efforts of holy cows of civil society in Croatia. And this is, holy cows are the women's rights activists, as you can imagine. but also Grevio, which is the enforcement committee of the, or the implementation committee of the Istanbul Convention, is also seen as part of this conspiracy. And as you see here, the Polish Episcopal Conference saying a committee without democratic legitimacy, experts who will determine what standards are to be implemented in Poland on education and so on, and that will blame our country with tardiness in changing the still existing traditional model of society. So very much the whole international setup is blamed for as foreign agents here. Okay, so what does this do then to the field of violence against women? So first, the actors. As I mentioned already, violence against women was a relatively successful feminist advocacy field. So there was quite some policy changes and policies, laws adopted, and some, so not perfect, of course, but there was quite some steps forward in this field. And in our previous work with Connie, what we looked at which were the patterns for success, what were the kinds of policy mechanisms or forms of activism that led to success. And we found two key elements to achieving success here. One of them was what is called transactional activism. Taro and Petrova coined this term. It is basically that those movements were the most successful who had very solid cooperation with their governments, who had insider allies to support them throughout the times. So rather than street level activism and disruptive action, it was through lobbying and through more institutionalized forms of activism that they could achieve success. And the other element of success was that those were the best and the most efficient or successful movements here that had diversified organizational forms. So they used diversified organizational forms. So they had, on the one hand, organizations that could talk to the government and go in consultation processes and do this kind of institutionalized action. But on the one hand, there were also other organizations that use more disruptive tactics. So meaning that when the negotiations with governments would fail, then they had also capacity to go out on the street and to make more noise and use more disruptive tactics. So this kind of push and pull was the most successful model, which we could see in some countries, not all of them. And so clearly these countries come with very different packages to this Istanbul Convention conflicts, and these countries and these movements actually. So, but then what happens? Why is this important? What was the pattern before? The problem is that now with the Istanbul Convention debates, what we see is that states become either permissive or outright they incorporate anti-gender voices in their structures. So in many ways, the successful transactional activism approach doesn't work anymore for women's rights activists. So they can. There is, in some countries, they have no access at all to going to talk to governments. In other countries, they may have some access, but they definitely have to still compete with the anti-gender actors. So transactional activism becomes rather problematic in these times. And then, so basically, the change, the shift, the prominence of anti-gender, anti-convention actors in the field impact seriously the relationship between women's rights actors and states. So they cannot, women's rights actors cannot count on the state support anymore, and not on resources, on commitment of state, or to very limited extent. So this pushes them basically to rethink their strategies. And that's what we see in all of these countries. Though it's important to know that, and I said this already, that they come with very different movement capacities here. So some are much more solid, much more diversified movement. And they also face different states. So it's not the same to fight the Hungarian anti-gender state or the Croatian more kind of neutral state, as we argue some places. So there is a change in how women's movements can now work with their respective states. We see particularly radical changes in two countries, in Poland and in Bulgaria. In Poland, until the ratification 2015, they have a rather open and friendly state. I mean, within possibilities of the region, of course, but they have a very good state movement relationship. Whereas from 2015, when the peace government comes in, the relationship is really outright hostile and impossible to cooperate for the movement anymore. And in Bulgaria, this is a movement with a long tradition to work very closely with the government on different aspects, with relative success, especially in the field of violence against women, and never discussing gender, so never a conflictual relation. And there again, the turn of the state against gender, the term of gender and against the convention, and I think brings a total disruption of the previous relationship. So what happens then? On the one hand, we find a reinvigoration of these movements and of activism, which is really interesting and gives us a lot of hope in a way. So we see a much more participatory and confrontative activism coming, which includes a lot of new actors, new generations of actors, new coalitions, more women getting activized in all of these countries, of course, differently depending, and I don't have time to go into a lot of details, but they all exhibit signs of these wider membership and new coalitions, and also we see new political alliances. So we see political actors who have never spoke up on violence against women, and they didn't really care about it, that now in the face of this politicization, they are speaking up. So we have just two remarkable examples is the Prime Minister Tusk in Poland before 2015, who's a center-right politician in Poland, and that was basically a guarantee before that they would not speak on gender. So now this period, he's really a fierce defender of the Istanbul Convention and very open person to talk to women's rights activists and to openly support their claims. So that's a very interesting, and the similar thing you see in Croatia with the HDZ Prime Minister Plenković, who's again a center-right person and speaking up in the European Parliament and also in Croatian Parliament in the defense of women's rights and for combating violence against women, which are very important alliances, or also another such alliance is, or such support comes in Hungary, where after 2018 elections, which were already rather a very polarized society by that time, and opposition lost again, and so all opposition parties, including far-right Jobbik, come together in a platform, and they propose a draft of parliamentary decision which says that the Istanbul Convention needs to be ratified because that's a condition for democracy in this country, which is really surprising. So that, and then you also see how coalitions that women's rights activists work with also now are much wider than before. So it's not just the usual narrow feminist constituency that you have here, which was the case before, but you have human rights groups and different pro-democracy groups and much wider coalitions. And in a way, what is interesting to see is how violence against women becomes a democracy issue. So and these kinds of coalition building helps in reframing democracy a little bit and making it more gender sensitive. So this is really important changes. But on the other side, we also see the backdraws of this and this is something that we were really not aware, but it came very forcefully from our data, is that there is fear and exhaustion and worry on the side of violence against women activists. And they are, of course, particularly vulnerable here because they these activists had a very fundamental role in working with violence against women policies. So this kind of attacks on them, in which the state is often a party, becomes very difficult for them. So we see fear from persecution and violence. We also see fear for organizational objectives, so that they are not going to be able to service their clients, so they're not going to be able to protect victims of violence. And in a way, it hits only some organizations, so you don't have that many raids, but everybody's afraid, even those who are not being raided. And you see very diverse coping strategies here. So there is a little bit of nostalgia in some countries for the good old depoliticized times when they could do their job without and could work with victims and services and protection without having this political turmoil around them. There is even discussion in Bulgaria of removing gender from the names of organizations, or not using the full names of organizations, but only abbreviations. And you have massive exhaustion in several places. So there is a lot of activists who also mentioned that, and you see a very exhausted and fragmented and falling apart women's rights movement in Hungary, for instance, where of course this is going on for 10 years. So this is the country where you have it for the longest time already, even if only one part of that was related to the convention. So this is some quotes, and I think I don't have a lot of time for that, but maybe I give you a good Bulgarian quote here, because that's maybe the most one of the really interesting ones. Oh, sorry. So it says, so every time we are going to a new place, new institution, new organization, we are a bit more cautious than usually. We present the organization not with the full name, but with the abbreviation. Schools became very suspicious and not very friendly about the word gender. We have to be very careful to gain first the trust of the school, of the director. Or another one from Poland. After the police raid, they returned the computer disk. I was afraid. I was also afraid to use the telephone. I feel paranoid. Sometimes I prefer to talk somewhere else outside the office. Sometimes I'm suspicious of volunteers or people who come. And the same activist says, a victim said she wanted to come sooner, but she saw the news about the police raid and she was afraid. So it also shows how this affects victims as well, and the perception of the support they may get from these organizations. Okay, so on policy implications, two things, and I see the time is running. What is interesting here is that we see a lot of new legislation coming. So it's kind of confirming that with politicization, you will probably have more policy progress. That's what the literature says. So we see new legislation, more services, shelters, and more budget devoted to violence against women, which is really interesting. But if we look at these elements of progress more thoroughly on laws and policies, what we see is that there's a lot of focus on criminalization. So that's the main field where changes happen. And then if you look more carefully at what these laws and policies bring, well, some are indeed in line with international norms, but there is quite a lot of other ones which are rather proposing family protection, framing. Some of them are outright anti-gender, like the pedophilia law in Poland. And of course, this predominant focus on criminalization rather than prevention and protection. And in terms of implementation, we see that EU money is we see again increase, enormous amounts of money start going towards services on violence against women, much more than ever before. And also the numbers in service provision are increasing. There is the reason for this is that there is a lot more EU money accessible for violence against women. But what happens is, rather than this EU money going towards services that were already in place and that were run by women's organizations and sensitive to victims' perspective, are now replaced by, or the money goes to alternative services and experts. And basically, in some places, money is altogether cut from previous services. In other places, the two live next to each other, but we tend to see, but the services provided by women's organizations are not increasing at all, whereas the other one is blossoming. We basically see an appropriation of the policy field with anti-gender actors and various corrupt state actors being the main protagonists here. And we also see a massive exclusion of women's organizations from any role they had before in implementation, consultation of policy processes, in monitoring, which is to the extent of zero access for in some countries like Poland and Hungary, and some very compromised and marginalized access in the better places like Croatia. So overall, 2 sentences on conclusion. First, we believe, some of the literature says the convention is a causality of the war on gender, but we believe this is not the case. We think that the attacks on the gender on the Istanbul Convention are very much connected to the focus of the Istanbul Convention and its attempt to make a very clear link between violence against women and discrimination against women. And so while this is clearly part of the war on gender, but the points of the attacks are very much about connected to the violence against women. And the opposition is so harsh because there is this mismatch between the policies that were passed before and this compromise that was found in the region to regulate violence against women but never speak about gender equality. Now the convention goes exactly about making that connection again and to enforcing that and to implementing it, and that's what they contest. And and this is very resonant with what we see in the attacks, that they oppose gender transformation, but they're not opposed to recognizing that there is a problem with violence, and they're also fine with recognizing that victims are women as long as they are very clearly different women and they are victims and they are in need of protection. So that's, and the takeaway for democracy is also very important for us. So this is a field at the individual level where we're talking about women's bodies, basically. So not giving them adequate protection and we see how limiting existing infrastructures and introducing others that are not gender sensitive is providing women much weaker protection and almost no specific gender equality specific protection. These are really about individual women victims' bodies, and also the smear campaigns and the threat to individual women active in this field. These are basic, fundamental human rights that are a part of every democracy. But there is a higher level problem here as well, with all the anti-Istanbul Convention and traditional values discourse. There is this message sent to women as a group, to all women, as being secondary citizens. It's like this message which says, well, protecting them from violence against women is not a legitimate state objective. And another aspect is this also, the curtailing of women's political representation that comes with this. by limiting access for women's rights activists to the policy processes or threatening them away from participation. These are fundamental limitations to democracy at the procedural level, and we clearly see these coming in this field, and they have important implications for gender democracy. So I'm done, and I've spoken a lot, but I stop right here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this very dense and actually super interesting description and analysis of this contentious contentious politics going on around the Istanbul Convention. And I would like to, so we still have some time, we have about 14 minutes, probably a bit more we can also take. So I would really like to open the floor for questions. So whoever, okay, I see some hands on. So Ivan, you are the first of my list here. Ivan Tramfik, if you want to go, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I'm working in my thesis on anti-gender mobilization in Southeast Europe. And my question is connected to both the policy implications you mentioned, but also to the role of the church, which I find interesting and I'm kind of focusing on right now. Because in Croatia, the bishops claimed at one point in a statement that the convention is problematic because, among other things, confessional privilege of priests will be endangered in cases of violence against women because they will have to report it. So why I'm mentioning this is my question is, did you find in the data, let's say, some kind of proof from which it would be visible that the problem with parts of the right or the church with the convention is this approach of protecting individual women as victims instead of protecting the family as a whole and protecting the marriage at all costs, which would be more in line with the church's approach. So this is also related to what you mentioned, this competition over services to protect women or to shelter women, which in some cases we know that feminist organizations provide this type of shelter, but also the church, at least in Croatia, is kind of also in this field of providing shelter for women. Thanks.
So Francesca, you want me to answer now, or you want to collect questions? Or?
Perhaps we collect another couple, and after three, I give you the floor again. So I see a question in the chat by Francesca Scrinzi. So if you want, you can have the floor. Otherwise, I read the question as you prefer.
Yeah, hello, I can read it out.
Yep.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. It was really interesting. And as I wrote, I hope that you'll publish the book soon. I had to go into the other room for 1 minute, so I hope I haven't missed anything. But I'd like to ask you if you could please clarify how radical right government actors or far-right groups in these countries have connected the issue of violence against women with issues of immigration, ethnic minority, and xenophobia, which are so important. This linkage is so important in relation to the ways in which the radical right mobilizes the issue of violence against women in Western Europe. Thank you.
And I see another person raising his hand, which I think is Claudia Padovani, perhaps. I cannot read the surname, but the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Andrea, very much. A very interesting, inspiring, and rich presentation. My question somehow relates to the question posed by Ivan, but mostly in relation to the policy implication and consequences and development. I think it was very interesting that you highlighted at the beginning, talking about actors and strategies, how different the constellation of actors have been in the different countries. So different components and mappings of actors characterizing different national contexts. And then when it comes to the policy developments and implication, the situation seems, at least from your slide, to be very similar. So I was actually wondering if this is the case, or if the different actors and strategy situations in the different countries lead to some similarities, but also differences in policy developments in the different countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Should I?
Yes, go ahead, but sorry, would you mind stop sharing your screen so perhaps we can see you? No, no worries.
I thought I stopped it. Is it stopped? Has it stopped? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good. So I didn't clearly get Ivan's. What was the real question there? I have some thoughts, and maybe I'm on the right track, but if not, just please reformulate a little bit so that it becomes clear. I think a lot of the frames that we are seeing formulated have to do with confessional freedom and have to do with religious freedom to choose. So and there wasn't enough time to go into all the details of these frames, but a lot of the discussion is formulated in terms of rights and in terms of often in terms of rights of people to freely choose their religion, to freely choose the education for their children, to freely choose the place where they want to go with their complaints, and also this point that you are saying, these confessional privileges, that is also challenged. We find that. And interestingly, also in Hungary, where the church is nowhere to be seen, and the whole, it's a very secular country, Hungary. So it's very interesting to see some of these arguments coming there as well. And then at many points, this is turned in ways that at the end of the day, it seems like their arguments are for protecting women and women's rights. So it is women who will be ultimately victimized if the convention comes this way, and we have this blurred notion of gender on the one hand, and on the other hand, this imposition of all kinds of educational constraints on religious institutions, religious educational institutions, and on what parents get from their schools, and whether they can choose for their kids to be in or out these programs that will come as a result of the Istanbul Convention. And then let me connect then to the last question, which was posed by Claudia. I think there wasn't, I mean, by the time I got to policy implications, there wasn't a lot of time, so I didn't go into much details. Yes, these are very different policy regimes, honestly. So don't take me wrong. There is a lot of differences between them, and we discuss those in more details in the book. I mean, the Croatian regime has always been far more developed than any of the other ones, and it's also, given the ratification and the overall a win in this Istanbul Convention struggle for the pro-convention side, and the way the whole process evolved, services are not shattered to such extent as they are, and also policies as they are in some of the other countries. But what we clearly see there as well, and I think that's very, very important, and it's quite shocking how the same increase in budgets for services come to Croatia as well, amazing increases. And with which actually all governments are so proud so when they report to international fora, they can report that they are doing much more, because look how much money they spend on this, and look how their numbers have increased. But then when you look even in Croatia at the numbers, what you see is that the exact same number of services are provided by women's rights organizations. So the entire budget increase is not involving those who had the most expertise and who developed the protocols and guidelines and everything for any kind of intervention in the field of violence against women. Those are not benefiting, but an alternative service provision sector benefits from it, which comes into the field without any expertise in the field. And not just that they have no expertise, because that's inevitable when you start increasing with such a pace, but that the protocols that are used by women's rights organizations and that should set the standards for how you do provision, those are not taken into the process at all. So that's really worrying, and that we also see in Croatia. In Croatia, for instance, again, the best student among the 4 women's rights organizations are excluded from a major bid for consulting, for counseling, on the basis that those who have already been providing services cannot apply. So it is not stated that it's women's rights organizations, but ultimately it is them who they exclude. So the pattern is the same even in the good places, but there is more or less diversity, or another diversity is in Poland, where you see that, okay, state doesn't give a penny to women's rights organizations. Moreover, they want to take back some of them what they have given before. But this is a very decentralized country, so you get some money there from local authorities. Whereas in Hungary, 0 funds, because that's a very centralized country, and nothing goes to women's organizations. So you see very different patterns here based on where we come from. Okay. So, and then there was the radical right screen, the other question. That's a very interesting question, and we see this migration issue coming in not all of them, but Bulgaria and Hungary and Poland. It comes very clearly, and we grouped it under this sovereignty thinking, but basically related and unrelated. So it is very clearly targeted to the migration issue. So it's not a wider xenophobic discourse revolving around it, but it's more like the technicality. So on the top of all this gender mess that the convention is bringing, it also has these 2 articles on migration. So that we see very clearly there as an issue. But of course, the whole sovereignty discourse is intimately linked to nationalism, and how traditional norms and Christianity and all of that are seen as to be defended, and that as being challenged by mainly the interventionist, the transformational approach of the convention. But we don't find any more direct links to xenophobia here, I must say. Thank you. Ivan, did I answer your question? I'm not sure, but
yes, thank you.
So we are a little bit running out of time, but there is still like a question in the chat. And perhaps, so if someone else wants to, we go into the last round, I would say. So yeah, you can pose your question yourself if you want. Go ahead. Petula?
Hi. Thank you. You hear me well?
Yeah, sure.
Hi. Thank you for such amazing presentation. I like the part where you talk about the reinvigoration of the movement, but at the same time, there is a price to pay. And then you presented the woman activist or the human rights activists as, fearful, they are being attacked, and they are, the smear campaign, and they struggle and they're exhausted. I think that is actually, from my point of view, is actually not a too pessimistic feature, because as far as I can see within the movement, because of the rise of the right-wing populism and all these ideas, nativism and all these ideas, that actually the women activist circle may be very divided. And some people want to collude with this right-wing force and you know, there may be, people may really disagree with each other and have a lot of polarization. So I wonder how you see, because I like the way you analyze this whole thing with the, you know, different actors participating, producing some sort of, you know, progress. But at the same time, it is not really the case. In terms of policy, there might be changes, but otherwise everything else seemed to be kind of problematic. I don't know if you understand my question.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. So you asked more questions in terms of the women's rights organization. Yeah, there was of course not enough space here to go into a lot of the details, but there is a lot of tension as well within these movements, and there is a lot of fascinating developments in terms of new generations coming in, and that's inevitable. There is conflict between different generations, and also a lot of conflict between different generations in terms of the tools they may use, and in terms of the also how they capture the fear thing. So that we see the fear articulated mostly by the previous, like the older generation feminists who were used to this more actional model and were never in this region exposed to such attacks. So, but then we also see how the younger generation is not so concerned about the fear. They also have less to fear because they're much less institutionalized, much less formalized organizations, much different tools, and we just had a discussion. It's interestingly, the whole fear thing doesn't come at all in Hungary. None, zero evidence for it. And we were talking with other scholars who do this kind of research, and we were thinking, oh, well, yes, maybe you don't even get to talk to those who left the field. Lots of people are just stepping out. So after 10 years of illiberal governance, you just, a lot of people left the movement, and of course they're still feminists, but they're not anymore activists. So that's also something we have. And there is a lot of exhaustion as well. So that's also, we see very interesting interview details in Croatia, how people are just getting very tired of the whole thing, even though they are on the better side of the conflicts than compared to Poland or Hungary. So yeah, I mean, it's I don't like to speak in terms of progress or no progress. I mean, we all decide what part of this we sense it's good news and what is not such good news. To me, the wider capture of the movement, it is good news. I think these debates about generations, between generations, the movement has to have them. So it's important that these are discussed. It's important that diversity is recognized, that it's reflected upon. So for me, that's a maturing of these movements, maybe not so much the ones that were already quite mature, but for instance, in Hungary, you clearly see a lot of diversification, which is interesting, and it's still small because it's a small movement, but it's still interesting. And also the link to democracy. I mean, I'm really hopeful in terms of making gender part of a democracy frame. And if this is the only gain from the Istanbul Convention, then I think we're better off than we were before. Maybe we needed these confrontative, times to make democracy a more gender-sensitive thing in the Central and Eastern European region. I don't know. So, I mean, it's really, depends on what you want to read out of the findings. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petula, for the question, and Andrea for the very informative reply. I think we have time for the last question that is posed by Birte, also in the chat, and she asked about exactly what's your opinion about the perspective for the futures in terms of center-right support that you talk about.
Okay, well,
just a very easy one.
Well. Thank you, Birte. Thank you for the question. It's difficult to tell. So in the more polarized societies, the Polish and the Hungarian, we clearly see how a center right gets to be more the democracy side, where the far right is really going against all of this. So maybe there is something to be gained there. I'm not completely sure about this center right movement. It's also difficult to this is a moving field. So the very center right Prime Minister of Poland went right to the European Union and became a fierce contestant for democracy and even against Poland in many ways. And so there the path is good. But he's also been criticized by feminists. So a lot of the feminists in Poland criticize even that period of government, which according to every measure that we have looks quite okay. So it's just very pro-democracy and pro-women's rights. A lot of the Polish criticize as being that period even as being not honestly gender equality, but just doing it for the sake of Europe or for doing on the surface. But if you look really carefully, then they haven't done enough. They could have done more, and so on. So yeah, and the same in Croatia, where this struggle was led by this center-right prime minister, and his political will was enormously important for the ratification and for pushing back on a lot of hostile communication. But at the same time, the way the process went, it still included, so it still legitimized a lot of these anti-convention actors. So, for instance, when they set up the consultative group for developing the ratification document in Croatia, it wasn't that the women's rights organizations and experts on violence against women were sitting in that committee, but also the anti-convention people were sitting in that committee. So here comes a very kind of a neutral approach to this. So basically, the center-right government is in a way in favor of the convention, but it still legitimizes all these actors to sit at the table and talk to each other. So it's not going all the way through. So it's difficult to tell where this will evolve. So we clearly see the limitations of center-right approaches to protecting women's rights in the longer run. But in these very heightened political struggles that were taking place around the convention, sometimes it was the important role played by these actors that made all the difference in ratification. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. And I think actually, yeah, I think on this also, there are some points as well. I will take just the last 3 seconds for, we see also like in this point exactly, so the specific role of the center-right as well, how it also played a role in Western Europe whenever there were some kind of at least discussions about about the convention, for example, the case of Spain, not about the convention, but the whole issues of violence against women, of course, like actually the role of the center-right has been kind of crucial as well in aligning with the left, unsettled left, in order to, kind of dismiss this type of argumentations against the concept of gender in and of itself. But anyway, just like a little reflection. I think unfortunately, we really have to go. And but I was again, I would really like to thank you. It was a very, very nice talk, and thank you very much for sharing this huge piece of research with us. And thank you for all the questions that came from the floor. Thank you to exactly all the people that made the debate a little bit more lively. I'm really sorry again about the the modes and the modality, but I think in person it would have been much nicer. but I really hope we will have time in the future. And I think now for all the participants, let's just move to the other panels. Perhaps we take like a 5 minutes break for like a very quick coffee, and we go back to our panels.
Thank you so
again
much,
for
Francesca. Thank you for giving me the floor and insisting on having me on in the event. So
absolutely. Was a pleasure. Bye, everyone.